Hello, welcome to Foreign Entanglements. I'm Matt Duss. I'm at the Center for American Progress. With me today is Jamie Fly, the Executive Director of the Foreign Policy Initiative. Good morning, Jamie.
Good morning, Matt.
Let's start off with the Foreign Policy Initiative. Your organization just yesterday, I think, published a new poll that you guys had set up looking at American opinions on foreign policy, etc., American engagement abroad. Why don't you just share some of the main takeaways of that poll?
Sure. We conducted this poll of 1,000 likely voters over 3 days in mid-September. I thought it was an interesting set of results that we got because the poll basically ended up, we didn't plan it this way, but it happened to be taken several days after the events in Libya and Egypt and elsewhere in the Middle East. And so I think those events had raised certain issues in American voters' minds that perhaps they hadn't been focused on as much in recent months. But it found a number of things. Number one, that foreign policy, although economic concerns are still predominantly the issues that are driving voters' interest in the election, foreign policy's importance seems to be on the rise in their thinking about who should be the next commander-in-chief. Other things that I was kind of surprised at, it probably was just reflected in part the time we conducted the survey, but terrorism still seems to be a very strong concern for many Americans. Even 11 years after 9/11, we saw that come through in a number of the answers to various questions. The voters that we surveyed were very hawkish on Iran too. I think it was almost 2/3, basically across both people who identify themselves as conservatives and in the center, believe that we should not allow Iran to go nuclear and use all means, including military force if necessary, to prevent a nuclear Iran. Iran was also at the top of the list of countries that voters felt posed the greatest security threat to the United States. No surprise here, but another key finding was that Israel has a lot of support amongst Americans. I think it was in upwards of 70% or so. The biggest, Israel was interesting because we actually asked voter views about a lot of different countries, and I think Israel was the one country where there were differences depending on what your political ideology was. So conservatives and I think those in the center were more likely to be pro-Israel. On the left, where people identified themselves as liberal, I mean, many of them were still pro-Israel, but there was the support for Israel was less strong amongst that group. So a number of things, but in general, I mean, I think our conclusion coming out of it was just that foreign policy does matter in this election, that voters are concerned about foreign policy, and that many of the people that we surveyed believe that America still has a strong leadership role to play in the world despite economic problems at home.
So, in a moment of bipartisanship here, that's good news for us, people who work in foreign policy. Not to make light of the tragic events of the last couple weeks, but it was really interesting to me how, after weeks and months of relentless focus on the economy, all of a sudden people were talking about and concerned with foreign policy again, which, again, it's tragic that it happened this way, but given some of the momentous changes that are going on in the Middle East, I think, more attention on the part of the American public to this region and some of what's really happening there is good.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, I think, unfortunately, I think there has been far too little discussion of national security issues during this campaign, and obviously world events have forced that to change, at least in recent weeks, and I think there'll be some opportunities with the upcoming debates for both candidates to lay out their visions of where they want to take America when it comes to foreign policy. But I think certainly the public would be better served by more discussion, because as events of recent weeks have shown, you can never predict when there's going to be some sort of crisis, and obviously any president needs to be prepared to respond to those sorts of challenges.
So I was not that surprised that, Americans are still interested in foreign policy. They still support, a fairly vigorous role for the United States on the international stage. I think there is some disagreement. I think different polls show how assertive Americans believe America should be, how much we should work with other partners, how much we should work within multilateral organizations. But it seems consistent to me that America, there's never been a real strong push among Americans that we should simply withdraw. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have seen more leaders in Washington on both the left and the right in recent years who have been willing to stake out positions that, I would call isolationist. And I think there have been some polls that have shown that on a variety of issues. I mean, other things I didn't mention, but, we polled on trade, and it showed strong support for trade. That's an issue which you just see the way the campaign's playing out, whether it's Senate races or even the presidential race. Some campaigns are running ads aimed at China, or this notion that jobs are being shipped to China and things like that you could perhaps characterize as anti-free trade ads. Also on questions of military intervention, we also polled on Syria, and this is, I think, also shown itself to be the case in some other polls, but we again found a significant majority who support some sort of intervention in Syria. Now it depends on, we just asked one question. Some other polls have kind of drilled down into specifics about how that intervention would occur, and then you get mixed results about the extent of the military operation that people are willing to support. But on all of these issues, I mean, you have seen I think a growing interest in this notion that, President Obama talks about it, just like some Republicans do, that we need to focus on nation building at home rather than playing a certain role overseas. And so I think it was heartening for us, at least, to see these results.
Well, on that point, this point about isolation, I know you've got the kind of Ron Paul, Rand Paul argument, that I think one could, more Ron Paul than Rand Paul, although Rand, does kind of tend this way sometimes. I think, has an approach that one I think could fairly call isolationist. Beyond, and I think that sort of Tea Party movement is considerable in on the Republican side. I'm unclear who on the Democratic side, beyond, say, Dennis Kucinich, we would really be able to call isolationist. Clearly there are people farther to the left who believe that the U.S. should be more isolationist, but who in the Congress would you say fits that label?
Well, I think there are probably a number of other Dennis Kucinich types in Congress, but maybe he's not considered a Democrat anymore, but certainly someone like Ralph Nader, his foreign policy views are almost identical to Ron Paul's. If you just look at what Ralph Nader writes about national security issues, it's all the same sort of lines of argument that Ron Paul pursues. I guess.
Right, but again, I'm sorry to interrupt him, but I think that kind of makes my point here. Let's look at the role Ralph Nader plays in the actual existing liberal establishment versus Ron Paul.
Yeah, and I think when you look at Democrats in Congress, the main areas, and I don't know that I'd call them all isolationist because of this, but you do have I think less support for free trade amongst Democrats in Congress than you do amongst Republicans, and we just saw the battles over the free trade agreements that were left behind after the Bush administration and the delay in getting those through Congress, and that was driven largely because of the Democrats and the administration's need to deal with its own base before it could let the Republicans pass them. The other thing I'd point to, and this is just, again, does it mean Democrats are isolationist because they take these positions? Not necessarily, but support for the war in Afghanistan and the president's own policies in Afghanistan has largely been driven by Republicans in Congress. He has never had the majority of the House Democratic Conference with him on his Afghan policy. And so, I think there are blocks on both sides, and that have views, I think, that perhaps do not represent the mainstream in a lot of our foreign policy, and so, again, I think that polls like this one or others that the Chicago Council and Pew have done, I think it's good to remind ourselves that many Americans perhaps are more willing to engage overseas, whether it's militarily, diplomatically, or economically, than sometimes our leaders in Washington would make us think.
Right. No, I think that's right, and I'm glad you brought up the Chicago Council poll, because I wanted to get to that, because I think that had some interesting information in it as well. But, I think a lot of it comes down to how one is defining engagement and how one is defining isolationism. Like when you bring up President Obama's statements about, being strong at home first, I don't think that necessarily, he's saying, yes, we need to pay greater attention to our economy, our domestic economy, our crumbling domestic infrastructure, efforts to shore up the social safety net, etc. Now, I guess one can disagree with that as sort of conservative versus liberal philosophy, but it doesn't seem to me that that necessarily is saying that this all comes at the expense of America's leadership role. It seems to me that it's saying if we really want to continue to play a vigorous role on the world stage, we do need to get our economic house in order.
Yeah, I would agree we have to get our economic house in order. I think we just disagree about how we go about doing that. I mean, Republicans, led in the House by Paul Ryan, have laid out a plan for getting our economic house in order and dealing. Another thing, I mean, I didn't even mention defense spending, but we polled on that, and voters seem to understand that defense spending is not driving our deficit; it's entitlement spending, and that's the elephant in the room that no one ever wants to touch. But Paul Ryan laid out a plan that tackled the entitlement problem. I know a lot of Democrats don't support it, but I think there's a general a sense of agreement that we need to be strong at home so we can be strong overseas. My only concern when when President Obama talks about nation building at home is I think it's probably an attempt to maybe appeal to some of those who are more isolationist. And I do not think President Obama is an isolationist, and plenty of Republican politicians, from Governor Romney on down, also have played those sorts of rhetorical games too, whether it's on China or on other issues. And so I think both parties are doing it, I guess I'd rather that they focus on a message of how we're going to fix our problems, rather than propagate this notion that we're not going to be able to do certain things overseas until we get everything right at home, because that's just not going to happen quickly, and we're always going to have problems that we need to deal with here.
Getting quickly before we move on to Libya and some of the demonstrations in the Middle East, the Chicago Council poll that came out a few months ago on the Iran question, I found it really, really interesting. 70% of respondents told the pollsters that they did not support U.S. military action in the absence of a UN Security Council resolution, even if Iran was if there was information that Iran was moving toward a nuclear weapon. 70% did not support U.S. military action without a UN resolution. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a remnant of some of the past debates we've had over Iraq, and even more recently some of the Security Council debates about Libya and Syria. I mean, my guess, part of the problem, I think, and I'm sure ran into this too with the way our question was phrased. I mean, it's hard, and this ties into the debate about red lines right now. You're talking about something that almost in the abstract, because it's not no one's saying the plane should take off tomorrow, and it's unclear kind of where the diplomatic process stands. There hasn't really been an effort beyond the discussions at the UN Security Council over sanctions to really have a prolonged debate in the international community about the military option. And so, I think that you'd have to kind of see how that process evolves, and my guess is that number would change just depending on developments in Iran, and also whether there was a serious effort to have that debate at the UN, and then you'd have a question of whether you could get a Security Council resolution, and if not, whether Americans would feel we should somehow allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons just because the Security Council can't agree that we need to take action.
Right, all important details that it's hard to get across in a polling question. I think the same probably applies a bit to the question on no-fly zones in Syria. I mean, when you say yes, do you support a no-fly zone? I think a lot of people that sounds fairly simple. Sure, you patrol the skies, you prevent Syrian aircraft from bombing and machine gunning its own people. I think when you dial down into what will this actually take? What kind of commitment and what kind of responsibility will the United States incur? Or what kind of responsibility would you support the U.S. incurring in a situation like this? The numbers might change a little bit.
Yeah, I think the Chicago Council poll, actually, I mean, I've seen somewhere else, perhaps not that poll, they'll ask for high-level support for intervention, then they'll ask you support bombing Syrian air defense sites, and all or much of the support falls away, which, to implement a no-fly zone, you're going to have to actually take out Syrian air defense sites. But so those are the sorts of tactical issues. I mean, I think, for me, a lot of these questions, especially when it comes to military intervention or the U.S. role in Afghanistan, it comes down to our presidential leadership. I mean, it's the role of the commander-in-chief if he or she decides to send American forces into harm's way to explain to the American people what the stakes are, why the operation is required, why we're doing it the way we are. And so those are all, and that's where you would hope, and we've seen this even with things like the President Bush's surge into Iraq, which was unpopular. I mean, over time, people's views of things change based on how it goes and whether it's explained adequately to them, too.
Right. All right, well, moving on to Libya and some of the other places in the region, Cairo, Yemen, where we've seen demonstrations against U.S. embassies and U.S. interests, attacks on a school in Tunisia over the past few weeks. Now, I think some of this can rightly be attributed to this ridiculous YouTube video. Clearly, there are people in the region, actors, who are using this as they have done in the past with the Muhammad cartoon, simply using this as a pretext to kind of exploit pre-existing grievances and drive people out into the streets. So again, I don't want to waste too much time on this video, but I think looking at the administration's comments over the past couple of weeks about specifically the Benghazi consulate attacks, I have to admit to being kind of perplexed about the way they've dealt with this. It was clear, I think there was a report even a couple days after the attacks that killed Ambassador Stevens and several other American diplomats, as well as some Libyan defenders, that this was almost a 4-hour battle that went on with heavy machine guns, RPG attacks, and pretty clearly not something that was just a spontaneous mob action. So I was surprised when I saw our UN ambassador Susan Rice on the chat shows on that Sunday morning saying, "Oh, this was just a reaction to the video." So I would assume you would generally agree with that critique.
Yeah, no, I've been surprised too by the shifting accounts, and I think on the right at least, there's been a lot of questions. I mean, are they trying to play this down because they're concerned that a foreign policy crisis like this in the run-up to the election will hurt them? It's perhaps a significant blemish on an otherwise pretty strong record, I must admit, for President Obama on national security, at least the way he's been able to portray it. And I think if you look at most polls until now, President Obama has had very high ratings on national security. It's actually one of the few areas where he, until recent weeks, was consistently above Governor Romney. And so there's probably an element of that. The other thing, though, a number of people in the Weekly Standard and elsewhere have written about this. I mean, I think one thing we've noticed is this administration, because of its overall narrative that al-Qaeda is on the run, al-Qaeda is essentially near defeat because of the killing of bin Laden, because of the counterterrorism operations in the tribal regions of Pakistan and Yemen and Somalia. They've tried to play down the terrorist threat and actually argue that, they don't like to talk about it as the war on terror, but you almost try to argue the war on terror is just about over. And when you have an incident like this, and this isn't the first time they've done this, they just don't like to use the word terrorism, which is kind of perplexing to, I think, a lot of us. And they, and dispatching the FBI immediately, for some of us, I think it raises concerns that we might be returning to a kind of 1990s law enforcement mindset in how to deal with these problems. And so that's just one other, I think, the thing that people have been paying attention to in recent weeks as this has unfolded.
Well, I don't know. I mean, just right there, I mean, I think the law, and I think dispatching the FBI there to investigate this was just the right thing to do. I mean, I think these attacks 9/11 itself was an attack designed to elicit a massive overreaction. And I think in a lot of ways that succeeded. So I think, kind of the way that we sort of dialed down, I mean, I have my own issues with the way the president has continued to exert some of his executive authority, whether it's the kill list, the drones. I think dialing down and focusing a lot more closely on al-Qaeda versus kind of a grand, monolithic war on terror, which groups in a lot of different actors and movements that actually have a lot of tensions between them, was the right move. Now, and looking at this more as a law enforcement, an intelligence sharing operation, and not setting it up as a war, kind of, a war between some huge, two huge competing armies, is the right move, both rhetorically and strategically.
I'm not sure about it in this case. I think, we knew the FBI had finally gotten in the country, I guess, a week or two ago, but then I think news reports came out yesterday that the FBI hasn't even been able to get to Benghazi, that you've had agents sitting in Tripoli, I think 400 miles away. I mean, you can't conduct an investigation when you can't even get access to the crime scene. And it's been news organizations like CNN and a few others, they seem to have gotten to the site and picked up things like Ambassador Stevens' journal and other sensitive documents. So the whole thing, I mean, just has a kind of, I think, unfortunately comic feel to it in terms of our that reaction. The other thing with the situation in Libya, I've for a while had some concerns. I was a supporter of the intervention. I'm glad President Obama intervened. I'm glad that thousands of Libyan lives were saved. I did not like how the administration went about it, both in how they spun it to the American people as somehow this was a hands-off intervention where the Europeans were really doing everything, which in reality wasn't true because we were providing significant resources, and it was only because of some of our niche capabilities in the end, like UAVs, that the whole thing was even successful. I didn't like how it was handled with the UN Security Council and the fact that we, I think, exploited a resolution which was not intended to be a regime change mandate and tried to act like we were acting in concert with it, which just, I think, has set up ourselves for the current debate about Syria. And then I've been worried about the security situation in Libya ever since, because there was a lot of talk during the intervention about how there might be some sort of European police force or international stability force, and the Libyans did not want that, but I think that we and our NATO allies should have been much more forceful in terms of insisting that there be some sort of international role, because as we've seen, the Libyan state just doesn't have the capacity to handle security. And the situation in Libya, it's not, even with some of the embassy sort of bombings in African countries in the past, where you have a functioning police system where you have control. I mean, you literally, from the reports that I've seen, you have camps of militants operating in various parts of Libya, tied into the broader region and events because of weapons proliferation. And Secretary Clinton spoke about this, the situation in Mali the other day. I mean, there's a serious security issue there, and we're not at the point yet, but I mean, we always have to be concerned about the development of a failed state. And I really think that, again, it's a question and you can debate whether or not we should have intervened, but if we're going to get involved in intervening in countries like this, and I think we should have, we own it afterwards. And I'm a little concerned that perhaps the president and his team were trying perhaps a little too hard to avoid to learn the lessons of Iraq, and perhaps overcompensated by trying to pursue this hands-off approach because they didn't want to deal with the aftermath.
Mm-hmm. No, I would agree with a lot of that, from the decision to intervene and concerns with the way that the administration presented it to the American people, the way that the resolution was passed and then used. I would just defend it in saying this. I mean, we always hear administrations in the past talk about partners having to take a bigger share, play a bigger part. And that has not happened year after year. It's the U.S. that at long last gets in there and takes up the lion's share, both in resources and money and time. I think what we saw was, a sort of halting, careful, somewhat clumsy effort to actualize that possibly for the first time. And it wasn't all that pretty, but I think it was very important to say that, okay, if our European partners really feel this is important, we're going to come in, we're going to use some of our assets, which only we have to facilitate this effort, but they're going to play a bigger role. And just second, yes, the problem of, okay, what do you do in a situation like this where you've essentially helped topple a government and establish a new government, and then that new government says, okay, thanks for the help, see you later, we don't want you patrolling our streets. I don't have an answer there.
Yeah, I mean, I do think we had a lot of leverage with the rebels, obviously in the immediate aftermath. I mean, we were the key to their success, and my sense at the time, I was visiting NATO very early this year, talking to some NATO officials about this too, but there was just no interest in the alliance for a post-conflict force, and so I think that, I do think we could have been more assertive. The other thing, even if we did not get involved in a more robust way last year, the surprising thing is, I've been looking into this in the last week, just what was happening in Benghazi in the last 6 to 9 months. I mean, there was a series of attacks on Western diplomatic assets and compounds, attacks on convoys of, I think, the British ambassador, other officials. It should have been no surprise what the security situation was in Benghazi to anyone. And some of this is coming out now, too, in the reporting about possible concerns that Ambassador Stevens might have had. I do think members of Congress are rightly, both on the left and the right, are asking a lot of tough questions because it seemed this whole episode seems to have revealed perhaps some flaws in the way we secure our diplomatic compounds and personnel, especially in areas that, like Libya, where there's an uncertain security environment.
Right. Looking more broadly at some of the criticisms that have been thrown at the administration, we have these demonstrations, we have people scaling walls in U.S. embassies, a school attacked in Tunisia, and I've been struck by this idea that this is because we're showing weakness in the Middle East. It's Obama not being assertive enough. It's America's so-called withdrawal from the region, our drawing down in Iraq, our winding down Afghanistan, and there were more attacks under the Bush administration than under any other president, and I don't think anyone can argue that the Bush administration wasn't assertive about American power in the Middle East. So it just seems that that's a bit of evidence that it's very hard to reconcile with this idea that these attacks on U.S. embassies are the result of America showing weakness.
I mean, I think for me the big issue is that President Obama came into office, especially with his early foreign travel, gave out the sense that he felt that he, just because of who he was, his background, who he represented, could somehow fundamentally remake our relationship with the Middle East because of his willingness to talk to people like Assad and the Iranian regime, as well as his outreach to the public through speeches like the one in Cairo, I think in June 2009. And I think for many of us, we just look at the situation and we just realize that nothing much has changed, and it's in many cases because of the inherent uncertainty coming out of the Arab Spring. America is in a worse position right now just because if we're not willing to be very clear about what our interests are, about what our involvement's going to be, about whose side we're on in these various conflicts that have broken out, especially when they become kind of militarized civil wars, we are weaker. And so I don't know that every single protest is somehow a symbol of American weakness and that sort of thing. But I do think there's a sense in the broader region that there's not a clear idea of where America is going with our policy. I mean, what is U.S. policy towards Syria right now? I mean, I think there's a lot of Syrian rebels have spoken to reporters who have snuck into Syria very clearly. They don't know what America actually is seeking in Syria at this point. I think that's some of my concern about the way we handled the aftermath in Libya, or how we're handling U.S.-Egyptian relations in this very uncertain period with the Brotherhood now in control. And so I think it's that basically sense that President Obama's efforts in 2009 haven't really gotten us anything, and his unwillingness to lead assertively in response to the events of the last 18 months has, I think, has diminished our influence in the region. I mean, others are stepping in to fill the void, whether it's in Syria, in Egypt, in Libya, and they're not groups or countries that necessarily share our values or interests.
Right. I mean, that's where I have to go back and make the comparison to the Bush administration. I think if there's anything that the last 10 years have shown us in the Middle East, is that even though the United States does retain a significant level of influence, our ability to just simply create outcomes through our military strength, through diplomatic pressure, etc., is very, very limited. When you look at the massive amount of U.S. military power that was deployed in Iraq and elsewhere, Afghanistan, in the region, and then try look at how much what did that get us? How much influence did that get us? How much anger did that create? How many attacks on U.S. embassies did that end up with? It just seems that this idea that if we would only do X, we could create outcomes that are better for us. I just question that equation.
I think my concern, though, I mean, even if you kind of follow that line of argument, is then, well, if that's the case, then, which I disagree with, but if that's the case, President Obama shouldn't even be stating things like Assad must go, because if you're not going to do anything seriously to back that up, people see you, especially in the Middle East, as weak, and that will have ripple effect and influence perceptions in other countries, not even just in the Middle East, but in the broader world, about whether America is serious and credible about backing up the statements of our leadership with real action.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that, I guess the conservative critique is that inaction and failure to just achieve immediate goals sends a message of weakness, and my response to that is that action on the part, we have evidence, that action in the case of the Bush administration's invasion of Iraq and subsequently becoming bogged down in an occupation and a civil war created very much that same impression of weakness.
I mean, I don't think that Iraq, I think, is very different than any discussion about Libya or Syria. I mean, no one's talking about, there's a civil war already happening in Syria. The question is the outcome is going to be bad for U.S. interests right now. It's getting worse by the day as al-Qaeda elements flood in foreign fighters, as extremist elements are empowered within the opposition. And so that is a problem for U.S. national security interests. Most experts agree that the best way to lessen the negative impact on U.S. security interests is for Assad to go as quickly as possible. And it's already, the fact that this has gone on for so long, the situation is much worse than it was a year ago in terms of the likelihood of a democratic, peaceful Syria emerging post-conflict. And so if all that is true and that it's in our interest for Assad to go as quickly as possible, I would argue the United States should be doing everything it can. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to occupy Syria with hundreds of thousands of U.S. forces. We have some real-world security challenges in terms of proliferation of chemical weapons, helping ensure they don't get into the hands of terrorist groups, things like that, which either by using U.S. forces or with U.S. allies, I would argue are in our interest. But it's a very different sort of thing we're talking about compared to the invasion of Iraq, or even if you talk about things like the military option to prevent Iran from going nuclear. And so I guess I'd reject the comparison. On Afghanistan, I think U.S. policy now across both the Bush and Obama administrations, unfortunately, is headed towards a real uncertain end. I do think the Bush administration under-resourced the effort, and I was a strong supporter of what President Obama did early in his administration in terms of sending the surge forces, but I think he really limited the impact of those surge forces by announcing a date certain for withdrawal, and I really don't know where we're heading in Afghanistan. But I mean, I'm more in favor of smart interventions that are done the right way, going back to our discussion about Libya, where, we understand if we want to try to intervene, especially militarily, we need to be prepared for the post-conflict situation, and we need to adequately resource the effort, either ourselves or with allies. And I think far too often, both in the Bush administration and in this administration, we just haven't done that.
All right, in the few minutes we have left, let's just move to the UN General Assembly. Just a couple of speeches I'd mention. The first is Egyptian President Mohamed Morsi. And, he made a speech, he spent some time talking about this Mohammed video, gave a defense, or rather a lack of defense of free speech, saying that, there are certain things that should not be allowed, blasphemy, offenses to Islam, and that's something that liberals, like sort of classic liberal, I think there's agreement among those of us, who support these values, that's just going to continue to be a real point of tension. I mean, yes, cultural sensitivity, good, but simply, denying people the ability to criticize religion, even offensively criticize religion, is not really something that I would say we are prepared to give ground on. So that's going to be a continuing sort of struggle. But when I look at the totality of his speech, which I think is very interesting in that it criticized the Assad regime, it seemed pretty assertive, certainly for someone who's sort of low-key as Morsi. I thought it qualified almost as fiery. And then very strong comments, criticisms of the failure to establish a Palestinian state, comments about the occupation of East Jerusalem. And what occurred to me is, anyone who... This is the speech that any supporter of Bush's freedom agenda should have been prepared to hear. Because I think, even though many of us would have preferred democratic change come differently to Egypt and some of these other countries, this is the way it's happening. It's a way that is particular to Egypt, particular to the region. I don't think it should be any surprise that religious conservatives have done very, very well in these countries. So again, I think I take some issue with people who are acting shocked about the fact that this is what the new Egyptian leadership looks like.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. I'm not shocked at all, and I'm certainly one of those on the right who I think the jury. I mean, I'm concerned about where Egypt is headed, but I think the jury is still out. I think that, but part of my concern is because I think for the real promise of the revolution in Egypt to succeed, we need strong, assertive American leadership. We need clear red lines to be laid down with the Egyptian government about where we'd like to see them go and not go. And I think far too often, again in the case of this administration, they've not been willing to do that. And they don't do that anywhere. That's just not how they think and operate. But even in the context of the U.S.-Egyptian relationship, where we have a very large amount of leverage with them because of our military aid, because of Egypt's need right now for other economic assistance, this administration is not adept at laying down clear red lines. And you just look at what's happened over the last year when it came to situations like the detained NGO workers. It was Congress, not the Obama administration, that I would argue is responsible for those NGO workers to being allowed to leave the country. Senator Paul, who I often don't agree with in the Senate, others in the House introduced legislation that basically threatened to cut off military assistance, and it was that act and the real threat that I think the SCAF, or the military council at the time, felt that I think forced them to let the Americans return to the U.S. And so that's one instance. But in general, I'd like to see the administration just be very clear about the fact that we want to ensure that the Brotherhood government and any Egyptian government respect the rights of minorities like Coptic Christians, respects the rights of women, and that they respect the peace treaty with Israel, but also, I think the real test will come in the years ahead. I know that Egypt's still involved in drafting the Constitution. There'll be a number of other kind of elections to follow, but I think the real test will be whether the Brotherhood leadership sets about trying to fix the economy and appeal to Egyptian voters, or whether they try to basically undermine the democratic process and help ensure that there's never a real competitive playing field for other secular or any other political party. So, I think that's going to be the real test. I don't think we've gotten to that point yet, but I am concerned if we don't have kind of clear American leadership that outlines where we want the U.S.-Egyptian relationship to go, that we may end up kind of in the worst-case scenario.
So speaking of red lines, let's just quickly at the end here spend a couple minutes on Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's speech, in which he famously, I think, brandished a what looked like a cartoon bomb to illustrate Iran's progress enriching uranium, and literally, not in the Joe Biden sense, but in the actual dictionary sense of literally, drew a red line with a magic marker, showing where he believed Iran should not be allowed to move past. Interestingly, he drew that around at 90%, which is, when they're at 90%, that they can weaponize that. But that aside, there were a lot of jokes on Twitter. I made some of them myself. I think Wile E. Coyote's agent is fielding a lot of calls for the first time in many years. But as a mode of communication, considering who Netanyahu's audience was, I think there was some cleverness to it. It was very simple. It laid out Netanyahu's case pretty clearly, and of course, it's on all the front pages of the newspapers. It's what everyone is talking about today.
Yeah, I've long been a proponent of red lines. A colleague of mine, Matt Kroenig, he's a professor at Georgetown, and I wrote a piece in the Washington Post a couple months ago making the case for red lines. I actually, I think President Obama this week also kind of reinforced his statement that he would not accept a nuclear Iran. He seems to come up with a new way every time that he gives a speech like this to show that he is serious about the military option if necessary. So I was pleased to see that. I still would like to see the Obama administration, though, perhaps lay out some red lines. My fear, as someone who worked on this issue at the end of the Bush administration and follows nonproliferation issues closely, we've had kind of red lines of sort passed repeatedly by the Iranians. 5 years ago, no one would have believed that we would ever allow Iran to enrich up to 20%, which is actually, people often don't understand, but it's a significant amount of the work to actually get up to the 90% highly enriched uranium. It's a pretty easy step from 20 to 90. It's much more difficult to go from 5 to 20. And, that sort of thing, or the fact that we would have allowed them to have a facility, if a facility was discovered at Qom, and now allow that facility to be operational, a second facility that they had not even declared to the International Atomic Energy Agency when they needed to. And these are all sorts of things that, 5 years ago people would have speculated would have led to some sort of military confrontation, and us finally kind of laying down a marker with the Iranians, and none of that's happened. And so I think if you just look at the progress of the program, people are concerned that the sky's the limit, that there's no clear sense for the Iranians about what line they should not cross. And so I do like the fact that Prime Minister Netanyahu has made this a focus, and I do think that President Obama's statements, and quite frankly, if he's and his administration want to avoid military conflict, I think the best way to do that is to be clear with the Iranians about where they should not go. Because my real fear is that the Iranians will continue to push the envelope, whether it's with the amount of uranium they've enriched, or even maybe enriching beyond 20%, and try to argue they need to do so for a nuclear submarine program or something like that. And I think there could be miscalculations on the part of the Iranians that could lead to an Israeli strike or lead to U.S. action.
Mm-hmm. One last point I would make. leaving aside some of the issues with the presentation that Netanyahu gave, I think the Arms Control Association did a very good, quick rundown of some of the problems with it. He not mentioning, yes, obviously enrichment to 20% is a source of real concern, but he didn't mention that a lot of that 20% uranium has been transformed into fuel rods for their medical research reactor, leaving Iran with essentially the same amount of 20% enriched uranium that they had in May. I think that is relevant. But what I think people haven't paid attention to, and I have a piece coming up discussing this, is the way that Netanyahu seemed to exhume this idea of a clash of civilizations, this idea of this Islamic extremist Voltron, putting all, like the Iranian regime, Al-Qaeda, all these different groups together as one, components of one huge monolith. In the starkest possible terms, a battle between good and evil. They want to control the world. They want to end the modern era. And I just don't see how that's productive.
Well, I don't fault the Prime Minister for doing that, because I agree with a lot of his take on the Iranian leadership. And,
So you think you agree with his quote, his Bernard Lewis quote, that the destruction is not a deterrent, it's an inducement?
Yeah, I think we've debated this before. I think that, Iran with nuclear weapons will be emboldened to take all kinds of action, be even more provocative in support of terrorist groups. And so, they clearly have broader ambitions. Now, do they have global ambitions at this point? Especially given the state of their economy, I doubt that that's the case. They certainly have regional ambitions, and they do not want the United States and its allies to play a significant role in the Middle East. We have seen them extend their reach and influence into our own hemisphere, and in Venezuela and their cooperation with Chavez. And so, I think we do need to talk about Iran as it is. It's a regime that supports terrorism, that's killed Americans for decades, and I think,
Yeah, I agree with that. But I think recognizing that Iran is aggressive and deeply paranoid is different from saying this leadership cannot be deterred because they want to trigger the apocalypse. I think when you say that, that's what's interesting, creates this interesting contradiction in Bibi's argument. And on the one hand, he's saying they're crazy and they cannot be deterred, but on the other hand, let's have more sanctions and threats of war so we can deter them from creating a nuclear weapon. You can't have both of those things be true.
Yeah, I think that clearly the Iranian leadership is not a monolith. There are all kinds of different individuals involved representing different factions. I do think there is a strain of thinking, though, amongst some of perhaps the people around the supreme leader that have an apocalyptic vision, and I think that's something we need to be concerned about, because even if it's just a small clique of people, when a country gets their hands on nuclear weapons, and Iran is also not stable. We do not know who's going to be in control in Iran in 5 years, let alone or even 1 year from now. So these are sorts of things we have to be concerned about. That's a whole broader debate, though, about whether Iran can be contained, and I'm with President Obama on this. I do not think they can. I do not think that's in our interest. And so, my main critique of the administration on this is President Obama has stated very clearly that he does not want to accept a nuclear Iran. I'd like, if he's serious about that, and I take him at his word, then I think there's a better way of him going about ensuring that we don't get a nuclear Iran than the current path that he's pursuing.
Right, I think, but what the point I'm making here is that yes, I think we can agree that an Iran with a nuclear weapon is a problem. But I don't understand how making these wild, unsupported claims about the Iranian regime's intentions to trigger global destruction actually, helps efforts to deal with the problem. I think these sorts of claims actually hurt that. It hurts our ability to see clearly what the Iranian government is up to. I agree with you. The Iranian government is not a monolith. There are some in Iran who have very strong beliefs about the coming of the Mahdi. Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is one of them. But in fact, the strong consensus of even conservative clerics including Ayatollah Khamenei himself, the supreme leader, is not messianic and have criticized Ahmadinejad strongly for his comments about, the coming apocalypse, etc. So yes, I think we can recognize that this is a problem, but without going that extra step and saying, oh, they're crazy and they can't be deterred.
Yeah, I guess I think at this point I'm not sure that any of this matters in reality, though, because we've been trying to talk to the regime, we've been trying to deal with the supreme leader and his emissaries. This administration and our European allies and the Russians and Chinese have had countless rounds of negotiations, technical talks, political talks, and we've gotten nowhere. And the Iranians have, with the exception of late 2009 in Geneva, have shown next to no interest in treating this whole process seriously. And so, I don't know that other than trying to lay out a stark choice for Iran at this point, including a robust military option that's credible, I really don't know what's going to allow us to avoid some sort of military conflict. I think if you're not serious about describing Iran for what it is, being and putting pressure on the regime, I don't think it's wild talk, but the fact of the matter is, I think there's general consensus that Iran did halt one key component of its program, the weaponization work, in 2003, and there's no small due in large part to the fact that that was the invasion of Iraq happening, their next door neighbor, and there was a real concern, I think, in Tehran that they were next on the list, and so I do think that the military option is a key component of this. But when you start, and the administration at times, and this week their messaging has been fine, but at times their messaging has been kind of all over the place on that issue, and I think that undermines the credibility of the option generally and makes it even more likely we're going to end up in some sort of conflict with Iran.
All right, well, I guess we'll have to wait till next time to definitively solve this problem. But thanks so much for doing this. Thanks, everyone, for watching. Visit our Facebook page, Foreign Entanglements. I'll see you next time, James.
Great. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks.